The sun had just started to lower behind the tarmac, casting a sharp gold streak across the private runway. Engines purred quietly in the distance. A jet sat prepped, cabin door open, waiting. A black man in his mid-40s walked toward it. Composed, tailored navy suit, polished shoes hitting the pavement with quiet authority. He wasn't in a rush. One hand held a phone, the other tugged a slim leather briefcase. He moved with the kind of ease that didn't ask permission. Then it happened. A white man in a reflective vest stepped into his path, blocking him halfway up the steps. "Sir, this jet is reserved," the man said, tone flat, expression unreadable. The suited man paused. His gaze didn't flinch, didn't waver. He responded in a calm, measured tone. "I know, it's mine." There was a brief silence. Not the kind that asks for clarity, but the kind that waits for defiance. A second later, two security officers walked briskly toward the scene. One of them already had a hand near his belt. Not aggressive, but prepared. The operations manager's voice grew firmer now. "I need you to step back, sir. You're not authorized to board." He blinked. Once. Then glanced at the tail number on the jet, as if to make sure he wasn't dreaming. He wasn't. No one asked his name. No one asked for ID. No one recognized the man whose initials were stitched into the headrest of Seat 1A. He could have yelled. He could have protested. But he didn't. He reached into his pocket. Not for a wallet, not for proof, but for something far more devastating, his phone. And in that moment, the story changed. Not because of a confrontation, not because anyone shouted, but because one quiet decision was about to tear through boardrooms, bank accounts, and reputations worth billions. If you've ever seen dignity mistaken for a threat, if you've ever watched someone's power be dismissed because of how they looked, then stay with me, because what happened next brought a $3.7 billion empire to its knees. While you're here, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Stories like this don't get told often, but when they do, we tell them right. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to know who's listening. Now, back to the tarmac. The call he made wasn't loud, but it would echo for years. Cameron Holt wasn't new to first class. He wasn't new to private airstrips or gated runways or long boardroom tables where pens signed away millions. What he was new to was being questioned like he didn't belong on something with his name engraved on it. Born and raised in Baltimore's Cherry Hill neighborhood, Cameron's journey didn't begin in luxury. His father worked 2 factory jobs. His mother cleaned offices at a downtown firm, the same building where her son would one day negotiate his first $100 million contract. As a child, Cameron memorized train schedules to help his mom get to her second job safely. He learned numbers before letters. By 13, he could read a supply chain like a novel. MIT came with a full ride and very few friends. He didn't join clubs. He built things. Things with engines. Things with wings. A few years later, he built a company. By 44, Cameron Holt was a billionaire 3 times over. Not a celebrity, not flashy, but in boardrooms, his name made people sit up straighter. His company, Vectorlift, had revolutionized how medical supplies and disaster aid moved across continents, using green propulsion tech no one had dared to scale. Cameron's private jet, the one parked on that runway, wasn't bought for status. It was efficiency. It was independence. It was what allowed him to fly from Berlin to Boston, then back to Nairobi, without missing a single handshake or document revision. It was also the very same jet he'd used dozens of times, always with the same charter service, same hangar, same staff. And yet this time, they looked at him like a stranger, like a problem. He didn't change. His suit hadn't changed. His voice hadn't wavered. The only thing different that day was their assumption. He wasn't flying for a vacation or some billionaire retreat. He was on his way to close the final stage of a $3.7 billion merger with Falcon Aerotech, one of the largest players in defense-adjacent commercial aviation. The deal would have expanded both companies into sustainable global logistics. Historic. Game-changing. And he was already set to chair the joint board. Yet there he stood, denied boarding, talked down to and dismissed like an intruder on the very jet he'd paid for, maintained and customized with biometric access and a custom cabin layout, none of which they bothered to verify. The same flight manager who once called him Mr. Holt, sir, now just referred to him as this man. So the question wasn't who Cameron Holt was. The real question, what made them act like they'd never seen him before? And why in that moment did his money, legacy, and ownership suddenly mean nothing? He didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue. He just looked up at the flight stairs, then down at the security guards walking toward him. His fingers hovered over his phone screen, and that was the moment he stopped being just a CEO. He became a storm, one with consequences they couldn't predict, because they never imagined someone like him could make it rain. Cameron reached calmly into the inside pocket of his blazer and produced his ID. Platinum-edged, government-issued. His name glinted under the sunlight. Cameron Holt. There was no confusion, no ambiguity, just undeniable proof. The operations manager barely looked at it. His lips pressed into a tight line, eyes flicking to Cameron's face with something close to suspicion. "We've had issues with people like you before," he muttered, like it was just another line of procedure. Cameron raised an eyebrow. "People like me?" The man didn't answer. He just waved over one of the airport security guards, who stood nearby like this was routine, like this was necessary. Still, Cameron didn't budge, didn't blink. He nodded once. "Would you like me to show the ownership certificate? Or just the registration email?" The crew didn't respond. The pilot, who normally would have greeted Cameron on sight, stayed hidden in the cockpit. The flight attendant stood inside the cabin, eyes glued to the floor. No one came to confirm his identity. No one came to correct the mistake. Minutes passed. Then a sleek black SUV pulled up a few yards away. A young white man in a slim-cut suit stepped out, holding a laptop bag and checking his watch. He looked frazzled, late. The manager's face lit up like a firework. "Mr. Langston." "Finally, sir. We were wondering where you were." The man barely nodded before glancing toward Cameron. Who's this?" "He was trying to board," the manager said, voice sharp. "We had to hold him back." "Right," Langston mumbled, already walking toward the jet stairs. Cameron said nothing. He just stood there, still holding his ID, still ignored. If there was any flicker of amusement in his eyes, it was buried under something deeper. A quiet, practiced disappointment. The manager turned to the security guards. "I want him removed from the premises. Now." Cameron laughed. Just once. A low exhale through his nose, the kind you release when you've seen it all before. One of the guards hesitated. "You sure, sir? He's not causing a scene." "He doesn't belong here," the manager snapped. "Get him off the runway." Passengers waiting nearby for separate charters began to glance over. A woman pulled out her phone. Another whispered to her husband. Someone started recording. Cameron finally lowered his ID and slid it back into his pocket. His phone came out instead. Still no raised voice, no protest, no visible anger, just a man watching others set fire to their own credibility. He made a single call. Quiet, precise, not rushed. And the men surrounding him would only understand the magnitude of that call much later, when it was far too late to reverse it. What they saw in that moment was just another black man being handled. What they failed to grasp was that they weren't managing a problem. They were lighting the fuse on a billion-dollar explosion. And Cameron Holt? He didn't need to shout to make the world hear him. He simply let the silence do the talking, while the cameras rolled and their arrogance became evidence. Cameron didn't flinch as one of the guards stepped closer, hand grazing the edge of his radio. He didn't shift, he didn't plead. He tapped the screen on his phone. One ring, then another. "Alicia," he said quietly, "cancel the meeting, effective immediately. Let them know we're pulling out." A pause, then a nod. No renegotiation, just pull everything." Before the words could fully settle in the air, he ended the call and immediately placed a second one, this time to the CEO of Falcon Aerotech. "Greg," he said, voice even, "your charter staff just profiled me outside my own aircraft, called security on me. I was denied access to the jet. No one verified a thing." The line crackled with stunned silence. "I'm terminating our merger, effective now. I'll have my lawyers issue the official withdrawal within the hour." No threats, no raised tone, just a matter-of-fact burial of what had once been a $3.7 billion handshake. Then Cameron hung up. Not a moment later, one of the guards stepped back slightly, confused. The other looked to the manager for instruction, but he suddenly appeared unsure. His confidence rattled. "What? What did he just do?" the manager asked, voice quieter now, almost shaken. Cameron stood exactly where they'd told him he didn't belong, in front of a jet with his name in the ownership papers. As the implications of his words began to sink in, the guard asked again, softer this time. "Sir, should we?" "Hold on," the manager cut in. He took a step back, then another. He pulled out his own phone, fingers trembling slightly as he started typing. People around them kept filming. No one interrupted, no one interfered, and yet everyone understood. Something just shifted. Because power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a voice on the phone saying, "We're done here," while $3 billion vanish behind that sentence like smoke through a vent. And now, with the camera still rolling, security no longer looked so sure. The manager's face had gone pale. They didn't know exactly what they just lost, but they knew it was big, too big, and far too late. 6 months earlier, the boardrooms looked very different. Falcon Aerotech had courted Cameron's company for almost a year. They wanted his green propulsion systems, cleaner engines, lower emissions, faster logistics. What they didn't expect was the man behind it, sharp, unbothered, and unwilling to sign anything that didn't benefit both sides. The deal was historic, not just for the scale, but for the shift it represented. Aerospace logistics had long been dominated by legacy contractors, old money, and slower thinking. Cameron brought a disruptive model, and he brought receipts. His routes delivered faster aid shipments to disaster zones. His cargo drones had already been adopted in 5 countries. Falcon needed him more than he needed them. Still, Cameron had played it with diplomacy. Quiet strategy. He didn't want dominance, he wanted change. Sustainability in a field notorious for fuel consumption. Fair labor standards where there'd only been exploitation, and most of all, inclusion. Not just at the table, but across the board. The merger was nearly done, signatures were pending, contracts reviewed, they were days away from making it public. Then came the incident on the runway. It didn't take long for word to spread. The story hit the press within the hour. The headline? Black CEO denied access to his own jet, terminates $3.7 billion deal with Falcon Aerotech. That image of Cameron standing calmly at the base of the stairs, surrounded by security guards and ignored by staff, went viral. By noon, Falcon's stock dipped. By close of business, it had nosedived nearly 11%. Their investors called emergency meetings. Lawyers scrambled. The PR team issued a flat, vague statement about identity miscommunication and routine safety protocols. But the footage was already everywhere. There was no miscommunication. There was no safety risk. There was just a black man with ownership papers being treated like a trespasser. And the world saw it. Inside Falcon's headquarters, panic replaced confidence. The CEO who'd ignored Cameron's call tried to follow up with clarification. Too late. Cameron had already released an official statement. This partnership required mutual respect. That expectation was not met today. I will not be moving forward with Falcon Aerotech. The internet exploded. Journalists ran with the headline. Economists debated the long-term impact. But those who knew the industry understood one thing clearly. Falcon didn't just lose a deal. They lost credibility. They lost Cameron Holt and everything that came with him. And it all died right there, at the edge of a private runway, under a clear sky where silence spoke louder than profit projections. The clip hit the internet like dry leaves catching fire. Cameron didn't post it. He didn't need to. Alicia did. His head of operations, the one who received his call that morning to cancel the meeting. The footage, captured on her phone and shared with a short caption, "This is how they treated our CEO outside his own jet," spread faster than anyone at Falcon Aerotech could control. Within 4 hours, it had passed 10 million views. It was on TikTok, it was on X, it was on LinkedIn, on group chats, on Slack channels in companies far outside aerospace. Then came the headlines. CNN, CEO profiled on his own runway, merger collapses in real time. Forbes, $3.7 billion deal disintegrates after alleged racial profiling. The root, we've all been Cameron Holt, just not everyone had the leverage to burn it down. People weren't just watching, they were feeling it, in their gut. The clip didn't show screaming. It didn't need to. It showed a man in a tailored suit, surrounded by security, being denied access to something he owned, while a white junior executive walked past him into the jet without so much as a glance. That contrast said everything. The comments came rolling in like waves. "It's the calm for me. Man had the kind of composure you only get when you know exactly how much power you have." He didn't throw hands. He threw equity, the quiet part. This happens every day, just not always to someone with $1 billion microphone. By noon, major black business leaders started weighing in. Statements, videos, full-blown panels, hashtags trending, grounded by racism, not just Cameron. A well-known CEO of a West Coast fintech firm tweeted, "I've flown commercial for 10 years and still get asked if I'm in the right seat. We've all been Cameron. The only difference is, this time someone had receipts and reach." Meanwhile, Falcon Aerotech's PR team issued a press release, so hollow it may as well have been written on glass. Words like procedural misunderstanding, reviewing protocols, and valuing our diverse clientele floated in white space. Nowhere in that statement was the word apology. Nowhere in it was Cameron Holt's name. Not once. And that omission made it worse. Infinitely worse. Because silence, once again, tried to cover what the world had already seen. And this time, the world refused to look away. The morning after the footage aired, one of Falcon's board members resigned. 3 shareholders went public, demanding internal review. A rival firm began quietly courting Cameron with a better offer. And the story wasn't dying down, it was escalating. Because what happened on that tarmac wasn't just about a deal. It was about the myth that success can protect you from prejudice. And that myth had just gone up in smoke, in front of millions. They thought they could sweep it under the tarmac. They were wrong. For many watching from the outside, the shock wasn't in what happened. It was in how calm Cameron remained. But for those who'd lived that same truth in executive lobbies, luxury lounges, and venture capital summits, the real question wasn't why he stayed composed. It was why anyone thought he'd stay quiet. There's an old belief that money buys insulation, that wealth becomes a shield. But Cameron knew better. His entire career was a study in balancing excellence with vigilance. Always having to prove ownership. Always having to be 3 steps ahead, just to be treated as enough. He'd walked into meetings where the intern got the handshake before him. He'd watched executives pitch his own ideas back to him, thinking he was there to assist. He'd smiled politely while being asked if he was the tech guy, never the founder. These weren't one-off incidents. They were patterns. And those patterns whispered a message that no amount of wealth could erase. You can be exceptional and still be questioned. Falcon's staff didn't see a billionaire. They saw a black man at the edge of their aircraft and assumed trespass. It wasn't new. Not to him. But this moment was different. Because while Cameron had tolerated microaggressions before, quiet slights and sideways comments in polished boardrooms, what happened on that tarmac wasn't a whisper. It was a shove. A public dismissal, a stripping of dignity in front of cameras and crew and strangers who all watched it happen. And still they expected silence, professionalism, grace under fire. They expected him to shrug it off, to call it a misunderstanding, to keep the deal alive for the sake of quarterly reports and polished press releases. They expected him to protect their reputation over his own reality. But that was the final insult. The question isn't why Cameron acted. The question is, why do we expect restraint from those who've just been humiliated? Why is it always on the disrespected to carry the burden with grace, while those who caused the harm get the benefit of forgetting? Cameron didn't forget. He just had enough. The ripple effect didn't stop at headlines. It didn't stop at boardroom panic or shareholder calls. It spread into the marrow of the industry, deep enough that silence was no longer an option. Within 2 weeks, 5 partner firms quietly withdrew from joint ventures with Falcon Aerotech. 2 went public, citing misalignment of values. Behind the scenes, whispers turned into signatures. A coalition of former and current minority employees began organizing, compiling documentation of internal bias, discriminatory promotions, and quiet blacklisting. A class action lawsuit loomed. But Cameron didn't wait for justice to be handed down. He started building. While Falcon scrambled to contain its losses, Cameron quietly launched a new initiative, one he'd dreamed of for years, but never had the push to prioritize. A black aviation internship pipeline, fully funded, national reach. Designed to place underrepresented students in aerospace engineering, flight school, and air traffic systems. Not just exposure, access. Cameron didn't hold press conferences, he didn't tour media outlets, he let the work speak for itself. Then came the next move, a bombshell no one saw coming. He announced a new venture, a 100% black-owned air mobility company, a fusion of green propulsion tech, cargo logistics, and emergency response aviation. By the end of the first quarter, private investors lined up with nearly $500 million in commitments. Because when a man like Cameron walks away from a $3.7 deal, people notice. But when he decides to build something better, something freer, something owned, the right people follow. He didn't chase redemption through apologies or courtrooms. He didn't wait for Falcon to collapse under the weight of its own denial. He just stepped out of their shadow and lit up his own runway. And as the industry scrambled to reckon with its reflection, Cameron had already moved on, not out of bitterness, but because he knew the truth. They tried to make him small, but he'd never been anything but prepared. In a world that tried to ground him, he built a fleet instead. They came by the hundreds. Some are handwritten, some typed, some scrawled in block caps from hospital rooms or prison cells, or night shifts squeezed between children's naps. Messages from across the country, across oceans. They didn't all mention the jet, or the deal, or the footage, but they all knew exactly what Cameron had done, and why it mattered. "You showed me dignity doesn't mean silence," one message began. "I'm 59, been working as a commercial pilot for 30 years, still get asked if I'm with catering. What you did, walking away from that deal, was the loudest thing I've seen in a long time." Another, from a father in Detroit, was barely a paragraph. "My son wants to fly now. He saw you on the news, said he didn't know we could own planes. I didn't know how to answer, but now I just say, why not?" They kept arriving. From a mother of 3 in Phoenix. "I watched the video 5 times. Then my husband came in and watched it with me. I thought he'd be mad. Instead, he started crying. He said, 'I know that feeling, of having to stay calm, of being made to shrink in places you paid to be.' We just sat on the couch and didn't say anything for a while. Thank you for not staying quiet." From a college student in Georgia. "You walked away from $3 billion and still stood taller than any man I've ever met." From a retired engineer in Alabama. "You reminded me that even when we build the plane, they'll still ask if we have permission to board. But now I know, maybe one day, we can just build our own airport." Some came from children, crayon notes signed to the plane guy. One simply read, "Thank you for being brave. Can I fly with you one day?" Cameron didn't answer every letter. He couldn't. But he read them all, quietly, thoughtfully, like each one was a page torn from someone's life that they'd finally been brave enough to share. And for every message he read, another reminder took root. What happened on that runway wasn't just humiliation. It was exposure. Not of him, but of a system. One that mistook calm for weakness, ownership for intrusion, and excellence for exception. But in the echoes of that single act of defiance, something else rose. Not anger, not vengeance, hope. Because sometimes it only takes one person to choosing dignity over silence for others to remember their own voice. And in those letters, those voices filled the sky. Cameron didn't throw a press conference. He didn't demand a seat at anyone's table. He just stood up and walked away from one. And then built a new one entirely. No shouting, no courtroom theatrics, no threats. Because the loudest thing he did was simply refuse to stay in a place that couldn't see him. He didn't lose his temper. He used his power. He knew what too many forget. Silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's permission. And Cameron had given enough of that. They thought they could strip him of presence, but they only proved why his presence was necessary in the first place. And while they scrambled to rewrite statements, salvage investors, and polish their image, Cameron was already elsewhere, funding future pilots, mentoring founders, designing the next leap forward. He didn't burn the system down, he just made it irrelevant. In one interview, weeks after it all went public, he was asked whether he regretted walking away. Cameron smiled and said, "When respect is denied, so is partnership." That was it. Nothing more. Because at the core of every title, every dollar, every deal, he knew what mattered most wasn't access. It was agency. They tried to deny him access to what he built. So he took the blueprint and walked. If you've ever been underestimated because of how you look, if you've ever been dismissed in a space you earned your way into, if you've ever had to prove again and again that you belong, share your story. This channel and this community are listening. Hit subscribe to stay connected to stories that reflect our truth, our strength, and our power. This is Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, where the unheard finally get heard.